Just before sunrise, on October 12, 2003, the residents of Argyle Road in Brooklyn were woken by gunfire. Then, as now, such a thing was virtually unheard of. The quiet street is in Prospect Park South, an architectural enclave of 100-year-old trees, landmark homes, and an urban gentry of lawyers, chefs and jewelry designers. With its air of Victorian charm, the neighborhood looks nothing like the rest of New York City. It seems like a nice Connecticut suburb, not the heart of Brooklyn. But that morning, as the police arrived on Argyle Road, not coincidentally, in minutes the worst came to pass. The body of a young man was discovered in a driveway just outside a Queen Anne house toward the end of the block. He was lying face down on a bloody yellow blanket. In the dawning daylight, it soon became apparent that he had been shot 5 times. 15 years later, the circumstances of how that man, Mark S. Fisher, a 19-year-old college student from New Jersey, wound up dead in the driveway remain the subject of a simmering debate in spite of nearly every fact-finding method the criminal justice system has at its disposal. There was a 2-week trial. There were several state appeals. There was a federal appeal. There were countless legal hearings. There was even an exhaustive inquiry by the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. But all of them have so far failed to silence the stubborn whispers questioning the case that have long been heard in the circles that surround the Brooklyn courts. Earlier this month, an appeals court addressed some of those whispers when it abruptly threw out the conviction of a man found guilty of killing Mr. Fisher, ruling that the prosecutors at his trial withheld evidence from his lawyers and relied on testimony from a witness who had lied in sending him to prison. Just a few days ago, at yet another hearing that raised more questions than it answered, the prosecutors suddenly announced that they were going to challenge the ruling that threw out the conviction, and if that failed they were prepared to retry the man, John G. Yuka. Many murder cases are built on science, fingerprints, ballistics, DNA, but Mr. G. Yuka's case was built from the start on something much more tenuous, the shifting stories of a group of privileged young people who were partying with him and Mr. Fisher on the late night into morning when Mr. Fisher died. From the outset, the prosecution's presentation was a kind of collegiate rash omen. People lied, changed their statements and often contradicted one another. This wasn't really a forensic case, said Mark Hale, the prosecutor who oversaw the probe by the district attorney's office. This was a case of who said what to whom, when. At the hearing on Tuesday, the lawyer who has been handling Mr. G. Yuka's appeals, Mark Abitaro, all but dared the district attorney's office to take the case to trial again, saying it had already been reduced to rubble. While the hearing left unsettled the question of whether there would be a second trial, it failed to touch on a more important issue. Notwithstanding the Fisher family's grief, should the prosecutors, given the evidence they had, have gone ahead and tried the case the first time? It was Columbus Day weekend in 2003 when Mr. Fisher, 6'5" and his high school's recent prom king, went into Manhattan with a group of college buddies. He was back in New Jersey from Fairfield University in Connecticut, and this was his first unsupervised trip to the city. Though he and his friends were underage, they used fake IDs to bar hop on the Upper East Side. They ultimately landed at Bar Harbor, a pub on First Avenue popular with college students. There, by chance, they ran into another friend from Fairfield, Angel DiPietro, who had come into the city from Long Island. Ms. DiPietro, 21, was with her own friends, among them a pretty young woman named Meredith Denahan. Within minutes, Ms. Denahan and Mr. Fisher hit it off. Eventually the Fairfield crowd set off for a different bar, Martle's, but Mr. Fisher stayed with Ms. Denahan to grab a slice of pizza and join her Long Island friends at their own new spot, Tin Lizzie. Ms. DiPietro had arranged to meet a friend from Brooklyn there, Albert Cleary, who brought along his own friend, Mr. Giuca. Though Mr. Cleary was 21 and legal, Mr. Giuca was 20 and could not get past security. By that point, it was late, or rather early morning, and stuck outside Tin Lizzie, Mr. Giuca suggested that they take the party back to his house in Prospect Park South. His parents were away. Joining the group of strangers, Mr. Fisher hopped into their cab. The night went awry as soon as they got back to Mr. Giuca's 7-bedroom home on Stratford Road. Mr. Fisher, already drunk, sat on a table, irking Mr. Giuca, who felt disrespected, as Mr. Cleary testified at his trial. As drinks were poured and joints were passed around, several more of Mr. Giuca's friends showed up. One was Antonio Russo, a 17-year-old high school dropout with a habit of carrying guns who lived around the corner. Despite their trappings of wealth, Mr. Russo and Mr. Giuca, prosecutors said, were members of a wannabe street gang, the Ghetto Mafia, which was obsessed with The Sopranos. As the night wore on, the two men became increasingly annoyed at Mr. Fisher. The authorities said, Mr. Fisher was a suburban kid who could not hold his liquor. He had been flirting with Ms. Denahan, whom Mr. Giuca appeared to like as well, and he seemed to be an easy target, someone the Ghetto Mafia could use to boost its credibility on the streets. At the root of the case's ambiguous nature was that a single, clear motive for murder was never established. But one thing was clear: when the sun came up a few hours after the group had piled into a cab, Mr. Fisher was dead. The investigation went nowhere for a year. When the police found Mr. Fisher's body, the only thing that he had on him was $12 in cash. But they quickly discovered his wallet in a nearby sewer and identified him. They also learned that Mr. Fisher's Fairfield friends had reported him missing. The friends told the police that Mr. Fisher had gone off with Ms. DiPietro and her own friends. That was how investigators learned about the party at Mr. Giuca's house. But most of the young people who had been there were uncooperative, said Raymond W. Kelly, the city's police commissioner at the time. An accusation disputed by their parents. The body had been found across the street from Mr. Cleary's house. And Mr. Cleary, whose mother, Susan Cleary, was a top official in the Kings County Republican Party, hired a lawyer almost instantly. Investigators said that Ms. DiPietro, who had slept at Mr. Cleary's house that night, was at first difficult to locate. But her father, James DiPietro, a prominent defense lawyer, said she made herself available. Within minutes of the shooting, police records maintain, Mr. Russo rushed home and chopped off the dreadlocks he had worn for years. 2 days later, when he was interviewed by the police, he implicated Mr. Giuca and Mr. Cleary in the murder. A few days after that, Mr. Russo, who had not been charged yet, bought an airline ticket and went to California. At more or less the same time, the police used his statement to arrest Mr. Giuca. Without more evidence, however, the district attorney's office declined to prosecute. Forensic evidence, in fact, was slim. While a gun was never found, the police had recovered 2 of the 5.22 caliber shell casings. Mr. Cleary's neighbors on Argyle Road reported hearing the shots, and police records show that some said they also heard a distinctly female voice on the street. Others claimed they saw a white car speeding up the block. Mr. Bitero, Mr. Gyuka's lawyer, contends that Mr. Fisher was likely shot in the car and that the missing shell casings landed in it. In early reports, the police themselves said that Mr. Fisher had been dumped in the driveway from a car. All of this, the kaleidoscopic theories, the stalled investigation, the constant media coverage went on for months as no one was indicted. It took a toll on Mr. Fisher's parents, who lived in the bucolic town of Andover, NJ. Michael Fisher, an engineer for IBM, and Nancy Fisher, a real estate agent, had never heard of Prospect Park South until they were told their son had been killed there. But on February 4, 2004, 4 months after the murder, the Fishers joined the police at a news conference across the street from Mr. Gyuka's house, urging his friends to share what they knew. 2 days later, echoing their plea, the Daily News published a scathing editorial saying it was beyond pathetic that the witnesses in the case had lawyered up. "Someone who was at that party knows something," the news opined. The question, does he or she have compassion and conscience enough to come forward? By May 2004, having already offered a $100,000 reward, the Fishers met with Charles J. Hines, the Brooklyn district attorney. They were furious with how Mr. Hines was handling the case and demanded changes. They soon got what they wanted. That same month, the Daily News later reported, Mr. Hines created an elite team to reinvestigate the killing, largely by going after the uncooperative young people. "They thought they could wait us out and thumb their nose at us," Mr. Hines told the news. "Anyone who saw pictures of that kid lying on the pavement with all the bullet wounds and did not feel a tinge of empathy is a cretin." Joe Hines, as everyone in the Brooklyn courts called him, had been in office for nearly 15 years. But in 2004, he was anxiously anticipating a tough re-election campaign as several candidates were lining up to challenge him in the 2005 Democratic primary. The Fisher investigation was becoming a political albatross. Mr. Hines needed a conviction. So his new team went to work. In July 2004, 9 months after Mr. Gyuka's first arrest, he was arrested again, accused of having shot at a group of men in Florida while he was on vacation. Law enforcement officials said at the time they hoped the arrest would pressure Mr. Gyuka to cooperate in the Fisher case, which he did not. The Florida charges were ultimately dropped. The prosecutors also empaneled an investigative grand jury that took testimony from nearly 100 witnesses. But by the end of the process, only 2 of them, Mr. Cleary and Lauren Calciano, Mr. Gyuka's girlfriend at the time, offered any direct evidence of his involvement in the murder. In an odd move, Ms. DiPietro, who had seemed so central to the case, was never asked to testify. In what was now his 4th interview with law enforcement, Mr. Cleary had completely changed his story, suddenly confessing that hours after the killing, he and Ms. Calciano had met with Mr. Gyuka at his house on Stratford Road. Mr. Gyuka, he said, told the two that he had given a gun to Mr. Russo, wanting him to show Mr. Fisher what's up. The testimony not only contradicted a polygraph test that Mr. Cleary had previously taken, showing he knew nothing about the murder, it also contradicted what Ms. Calciano said. In her own testimony, the 5th time she had talked to the authorities, Ms. Calciano changed her story, too, admitting for the first time that she and Mr. Cleary had indeed met with Mr. Gyuka after the murder. But her version of the meeting was different. She claimed Mr. Gyuka had told them that Mr. Russo had approached him, not vice versa, asking for the gun because he wanted to rob Mr. Fisher. Mr. Cleary had also accused Ms. Calciano of hiding evidence after the shooting, a claim she denied. This evidence, while far from ideal, was enough to secure indictments. And on November 23, 2004, 13 months after Mr. Fisher's body was found, Mr. Russo was arrested. Mr. Gyuka was arrested the following month. But before the case went to trial, a surprise witness emerged, John Avito, a career criminal who met Mr. Gyuka when they were housed together in a jail on Rikers Island. Mr. Avito, who had a history of drug abuse, had just been released to a treatment center and almost immediately relapsed. When a warrant was issued for his rearrest, he called the police, telling them that Mr. Gyuka, in a jailhouse buddy way, had confessed to the murder. Offering to help the investigation, Mr. Avito said that Mr. Gyuka had not only admitted to furnishing the gun that killed Mr. Fisher, but was actually present at the murder scene himself. Tantalizing as it was, this new account had a curious problem. It was notably different from all of the other stories the prosecution had heard. But with the testimony finally in place, opening arguments began in State Supreme Court in Brooklyn on September 14, 2005. What had for months merely been a messy investigation now turned into a circus. Mr. Gyuka and Mr. Russo were tried together, but with separate juries to decide their separate fates. Reporters packed the courtroom, angling for views of Mr. Fisher's parents. The city's tabloid newspapers were calling it the Grid Kid case, a reference to the victim's high school football days. The lead prosecutor, Anasiga Nicolazzi, a star of the district attorney's homicide bureau, led the jury through her witnesses' conflicting stories, that Mr. Gyuka had given the murder weapon to Mr. Russo on request, that he actively provided it, that he had personally taken part in the killing. At no time, however, did Ms. Nicolazzi mention the police department's first theory, that Mr. Fisher had been dumped from a car. Nor did she tell the jury about the neighbors who had heard a woman's voice. Instead, calling Mr. Fisher a lamb surrounded by wolves, Ms. Nicolazzi downplayed the inconsistencies, saying they were natural. In fact, she said, they were proof that the witnesses had not been coached and after months of dissembling had finally come clean. Mr. Gyuka's lawyer, Sam Gregory, an old-time Court Street hand, argued that Mr. Russo had acted on his own and that Mr. Gyuka was outraged by the murder. Mr. Gregory also claimed that Mr. Cleary and Ms. Calciano had been coerced into testifying. When the trial concluded on September 26, it took 3 days for Mr. Russo's jury to return a guilty verdict, but Mr. Gyuka's jury convicted him in less than 2 hours. Moments after the jurors were polled, Mr. Gyuka's mother, Doreen Giuliano, angrily turned to the case detective sitting near her. "Feel good now?" she asked. Ms. Giuliano had always thought the case was a setup. Before the trial, she had created a website, freejoengiuca.com. At her son's sentencing, where he was given 25 years to life in prison, she wore a Free John Gyuka t-shirt. After she showed up possibly in a menacing way at one of Ms. Nicolazzi's other court cases, the prosecutor hired a bodyguard. But in 2007, after Mr. Gyuka was imprisoned, Ms. Giuliano's activism reached new heights. She undertook a bizarre one-woman sting operation, targeting a juror at her son's trial she felt was compromised. Dyeing her hair and donning high heels and a push-up bra, Ms. Giuliano left Prospect Park South, moved into the juror's neighborhood and, for nearly a year, stalked him on a bicycle until they met one day when she almost ran him down. She told the juror, Jason Allo, her name was Dee Quinn. Mr. Allo gave her his phone number. Over the course of a flirtation that lasted months, Ms. Giuliano recorded Mr. Allo with a hidden digital device. What she learned eventually made its way into a motion to dismiss her son's conviction, that, among other things, Mr. Allo had known people on the trial witness list but never disclosed that during jury selection, a fact that could have disqualified him. The motion was denied by two separate courts, one of which called her seduction vigilante behavior. It was not the only unusual effort to save Mr. Giuca. In 2013, not long after Mr. Avito, the jailhouse informer, got out of another stint in prison, he started getting phone calls from a woman named Nicole. Nicole, saying that she understood the convict's life, confided in Mr. Avito that her brother had been killed in prison. In the next few months, the two spoke on the phone or traded texts 1,573 times, court records show. Eventually, Mr. Avito broke down and confessed to Nicole that he had lied about Mr. Giuca's role in the murder. But then Nicole had lied too. Her real name was Marley Davis, and she had been Mr. Giuca's fiancée. On Ms. Davis's advice, Mr. Avito met with Mr. Bitero, the appellate lawyer. And on January 31, 2014, Mr. Avito formally submitted an affidavit saying he had fabricated his testimony. "My hope," he wrote, "was that the DA believed I was useful to them and that in return the DA would help me with my case." Something similar also happened to Ms. Calciano, Mr. Giuca's former girlfriend. Married by then and known as Lauren McCulloch, she had recently discovered that Mr. Giuca had written a letter from prison to her father, begging him to ask her to recant her trial testimony. Persuaded by the letter, she gave Mr. Bitero her own affidavit, saying the prosecution had pressured and frightened her into implicating Mr. Giuca. "It was something," she wrote, "that for years I have thought about and regretted." The details of the affidavit were startling. In it, Ms. McCulloch, as she was now called, accused Mr. Hines' team of having coerced her testimony years before by threatening to expose embarrassing photos Mr. Giuca had of her. She also claimed that unless she cooperated, the prosecutors said they would reveal at trial that she had once had an abortion. Armed with all of this, Mr. Bitero tried again to challenge Mr. Giuca's conviction. Though courts had already ruled against him several times, it seemed like an auspicious moment. A few months earlier, Mr. Hines had been defeated in another re-election race by Ken Thompson, a professed reformer who repeatedly attacked him on the issue of wrongful convictions. During the election, Mr. Thompson had expressed doubts about Mr. Giuca's prosecution, especially after Mr. Hines took the peculiar step of hiring Angel DiPietro, the witness who was never asked to testify, as an assistant district attorney just before her father donated to his campaign. There was one more encouraging sign. When Mr. Thompson entered office, one of his first moves was beefing up a special unit that reviews wrongful convictions. And in February 2014, Mr. Bitero filed a 76-page petition asking the unit to reconsider Mr. Gyuka's guilty verdict. But within a year, the unit returned its verdict. It was standing behind the conviction. After an internal inquiry, the prosecutors had decided that they did not find the new statements by Ms. McCulloch and Mr. Avito to be credible. They also noted that Mr. Cleary had never wavered from his own testimony. Moreover, in nearly a decade of trials and appeals, Mr. Gyuka had never offered an alibi, they said, or any other exculpatory evidence. At a news conference announcing the decision, Mr. Thompson, who has since died of cancer, repeated Mr. Hines's long-standing position. Despite the inconsistencies in the case, Mr. Gyuka was guilty. But in a startling admission, Mr. Thompson left open another possibility, that other people, who were never charged, might have also been involved. So what really happened on that cool October morning 15 years ago? Mr. Fisher's parents have always maintained that Angel DiPietro knew more about their son's death than she let on. In fact, in 2006, 1 year after Mr. Gyuka's trial, they sued her, claiming she was liable for taking Mr. Fisher in his disoriented state to a home full of violent individuals. When the suit was filed, the couple went public with their suspicion that others, especially a woman, had played some role in the killing. The suit, which was eventually dismissed, also had harsh words for Mr. Cleary, noting that at the time of the shooting he was on probation for brutally beating someone in the Bronx. At the hearing on Tuesday, Mr. Bitero also went after Ms. DiPietro, accusing her of having lied for years to investigators. He had a similar theory about Mr. Cleary, who swiftly went from being a suspect in the matter to one of the prosecution's main witnesses. In court papers, Mr. Bitero has pointed out that when Mr. Hines feared losing his Democratic primary amid the chaos of the Gyuka case, he started laying plans to run as a Republican. Those plans required the endorsement of the local Republican Party, which Mr. Cleary's mother helped run and which he ultimately got. Many of these old, half-forgotten details came to the fore at the Tuesday hearing after the case was upended by an appellate court on February 7. In a unanimous decision, the Second Judicial Department Appeals Court tossed out Mr. Gyuka's conviction, ruling that under Mr. Hines, the district attorney's office had badly bungled how it handled Mr. Avito on the witness stand. The office, now run by a new district attorney, Eric Gonzalez, was asked how it planned to proceed with the case. Mr. Gonzalez followed the trail blazed by his predecessors. He decided to appeal the court's ruling and, if necessary, to retry Mr. Gyuka. Everyone in court that day looked older. Arriving from a holding cell on Rikers Island, Mr. Gyuka, now 34, was brought into the room wearing a blazer a size too big for him and the vacant gaze of a man who, as Mr. Bitero told the judge, was on the 4,806th day of his imprisonment. Though his mother, Ms. Giuliano, also looked haggard, she remained unbent. During the proceeding, she shouted at the reporters in the jury box, "He's innocent." Sitting across the aisle from her, Mr. Fisher's parents barely spoke, radiating an undiminished grief. Missing from the hearing was Anna-Sigga Nicolazzi, the former trial prosecutor, who had left the district attorney's office several months ago for a new job starring as herself in the TV crime series True Conviction. In her place, another prosecutor, Joseph Alexis, asked Justice Danny K. Chun to keep Mr. Ji Yuka in custody while the office sought to vacate his appeal. The request seemed to enrage Mr. Bidero, who stepped up to the podium and wondered aloud how the district attorney planned to pursue a new trial. One of their witnesses, Ms. McCulloch, had recanted, he said. Another, Mr. Avito, had been thoroughly discredited by the appeals court. That left Mr. Cleary, who, Mr. Bidero went on, was a devious liar with a questionable connection to Mr. Hines. As for Ms. DiPietro, Mr. Bidero said he doubted that the prosecutors would call her as a witness, considering that she now worked in their office. There is no path to victory for the D.A., he maintained. But Justice Chun disagreed and ordered Mr. Ji Yuka to be taken back to jail as yet another court decided his fate. Before the hearing ended, the judge suggested a tentative date for trial in early May. Mr. Bidero requested May 1st. "We want the quickest trial possible," he said. Then it was over and, in a familiar scene, two court officers handcuffed Mr. Ji Yuka and took him away.